Let's talk about all of these developments with our opening panel. First, we have retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel and current president of KIP, Hal Kempfer. Also joining us is Behnam Taleblu, research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. Hal, Iran is firing missiles directly at Israel. This weekend, people were skiing in Israel's north. They could have been killed were it not for Israel's Iron Dome technology. Iran firing a surface-to-surface missile at the Hermon ski resort. That's some footage of the people on the slopes. Now, thankfully, this was intercepted by the Iron Dome missile defense system. But hell, this is Iran attacking Israeli civilians with missiles. Is this not a full-on act of war?
Michelle, as we define the act of war or acts of war, this would appear to meet the litmus test. I mean, certainly it could be interpreted that this was an attack. It was a nation state on a nation state. It was shooting a missile that was aimed at a target. And frankly, the target was a mass casualty target if it had hit. Fortunately, the Iron Dome system intercepted. But I don't know that there's too many other ways to interpret it. With that said, I don't know that Israel wants to escalate it quite to that point on the international law spectrum to call it that. But I have to say this, the Israeli retaliation, the very targeted airstrikes, very precise strikes, they knew exactly where they were going, sent a very clear message. And if Iran persists, Israel has a lot more that they could do militarily to respond to this.
All right, well, we'll get into some of those military options in a while. Behnam, Israel demonstrating tremendous restraint here. Would any other country tolerate having missiles fired at its civilians over its sovereign land like this?
Likely not, and great to be with you, Michelle, and hello to the fellow panelists. I think it's quite important to note that Iran and Israel have been engaging in this cat-and-mouse game in Syria for quite some time now. And as the Iranian footprint in Syria has deepened, Israel's target selection has also changed. Israel has gone from targeting small ammunitions depots to actual warehouses to actual command and control centers. And that's because Iran is changing its way of war in Syria and finding new ways to test Israel. Now, I've seen some conflicting reporting over the weekend. Was it actually a surface-to-surface missile, or was it a guided short-range artillery rocket? I know it's a small discrepancy, but it matters because it tells us what type of ammunition is Iran supplying the Shia militias, the Assad regime, and the Quds Force with, and how far is it willing to project these munitions? It's worth noting that in 2018, we had the first direct Israeli-Iranian confrontation with the T-4 base and the drone. Now this steps that up a notch and is another story in the larger game of Iranian and Israeli graduated escalation in Syria.
Hal, Iran is clearly trying to up the ante. What is Iran's strategy with this direct attack on Israel?
You know, Michelle, that's kind of a question. I don't know what they hope to get at it. I think test is probably the best way to describe it. They're seeing how far they can push. One thing that's very clear is that the Russians really don't have much influence to push the Iranians out of Syria. And I think Iran is seeing Syria as basically a base, an Iranian base to attack Israel. And they're just seeing how far they can push and seeing what Israel will allow or not allow. I think the retaliatory strikes has sent a very clear message. Israel is still showing quite a bit of restraint, but they're also showing they have capabilities that they hadn't been using so far, that they could go even further.
Behnam, Israel is now acknowledging that it has taken out Iranian weapons, munitions, and military sites, as well as other targets in Syria. There was also a daylight attack, which is unusual for Israel. And this public acknowledgement, why is Israel taking this position?
I think publicity is important. You know, there are some who say that no, Israel should consistently mask its hand when it's pushing back on Iran in Syria. But I think it sends a strong message to Iran, and as part of the bare your teeth strategy that the guest also mentioned, this also says that the Israelis are not afraid to own up to the attacks, because that would force the Iranians to respond, which in case would force the Israelis to respond. Again, the Iranian side has been a little bit more coy, not necessarily calling everything an attack, changing the names of certain munitions, making sure that it's one level removed. That's why Iran consistently operates through proxies. But the willingness of both sides to enter into a little bit more direct confrontation shows you just how catastrophic the Syrian civil war has been for the entire region.
Well, Hal, do you see this escalating to a point that Israel strikes Iran in Iran, or do you think Israel is going to confine its attacks to Syria?
Well, it's difficult to say for sure, but I think they're going to try and confine their attacks to Syria. I don't think they want this thing to escalate. One thing I would say is they like to use proxies, they like to use Hezbollah, but when you're using Quds Force, that pretty much is Iranian forces. There's just really no two ways to slice that. And with the retaliatory attacks going at Quds Force targets, also the specific targets that they went after, and doing a daylight raid. Doing a daylight raid like that is a very bold move, and it says we have capabilities that you weren't aware of or you didn't properly assess, and we can do a lot more than what we've been doing so far. All those things kind of combined to to basically put forward a very clear message to Iran that you need to pull back.
Behnam, if this is an exercise in PR, or partly so, by Israel publicly acknowledging this and identifying some of the targets that it hit on Twitter, as the Israeli Defense Forces have done, who is Israel appealing to on the international stage? What is it setting the scene for?
I think it's appealing to the broader international community because you asked the right question the first time, which is who else would tolerate this? Iran is basically surrounding Israel, if not by Quds Force members, but by proxies. Through Gaza, you have Hamas. Later on, you have on the other side of Israel, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah to the north, and then the Shiite proxies, Quds Force, and the Assad regime basically to the east. This is a challenge to Israel's legitimacy. Iran has long-standing ties to the Assad regime simply because it has wanted to press this threat for Israel. So Israel is broadening the case. You had the very important speech by Ambassador Danan today about Iran's support to these Palestinian rejectionist and terrorist groups, as well as other proxies in the Middle East. So Israel wants all those European states who constantly hype the Iran threat to put their money where their mouth is.
All right, we'll discuss the diplomatic aspect of this as well as other aspects. Stick around, Behnam. And we're back with Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer and Behnam Ben Taleblu discussing Israel's strikes on Iranian targets in Syria. This after Iran launched a missile at Israel's north. Thanks to the Iron Dome, skiers at the Hermon ski site were not hurt because the technology intercepted that missile. But it is bringing into question how this war could escalate. And we're seeing the damage. Satellite images, Hal, have been released of the buildings and warehouses that Israel took out near Damascus's airport. There are reports, Hal, that the Russians have asked Israel to lay off the attacks near the airport. They're planning on renovating it and making it commercially viable again. The Israeli Defense Force says that ultimately it's holding Syria responsible for this attack and warning that Syria is going to pay the price for allowing Iran to establish these permanent military bases in its territory. Syria, on one level, is trying to rebuild itself. Is there any chance that Syria now tries to rein in Iran?
Well, I think that what we're seeing is that Syria, there is no real choice. You have to hold Syria as a host nation accountable. Whatever Iran is doing there, you have to hold the host nation accountable. And certainly the Assad government can't claim that they don't control the territory or something like that. They control enough territory, and they certainly control the territory where the Quds Force is operating, that there is no ambiguity in that. Now, if there's going to be more strikes, what you could see is a real stop in any improvement to Syria, which will put the Syrian regime and the legitimacy of the Syrian regime into a little bit of jeopardy if they can't turn things around from a socioeconomic standpoint in a fairly quick manner.
Well, Behnam, to that point, Syria does have economic plans. Russia has economic plans for Syria. At what point do they see Iran's presence there as interfering with these plans to a significant enough level that the Russians and perhaps the Syrians consider curbing Iran?
Well, the real question is, can they curb Iran, and you know, what are the end games here? The Russians, we know, want to rebuild part of Syria, at least the parts that they're interested in, want to have strong central authority, and also want to have the military base there. But the Iranians are wedded to the Assad regime and to the person of Assad in particular, which means that they might have longer-term different goals. And the Iranians are also trying to cash in on some of these commercial contracts. Therefore, it behooves the U.S. administration to make sure that there is no reconstruction aid given to the Assad regime or to areas that Iranian proxies, Iranian forces are known to own or control or operate in. So basically having a strategy of denial. And in a time when the U.S. is looking to pull back forces, the primacy of that economic strategy is even more felt.
Behnam, where are we on the diplomatic front? We know that U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has called for this global summit on Iran in Poland. We're learning from Poland's foreign minister that Iran is not invited to attend, saying that its presence there would hamper any kind of progress. Behnam, we're also learning that the EU is unlikely to come to this summit. Is there any hope for bigger diplomacy in reining Iran in?
You know, honestly, in 2019, there better be, because the U.S. needs to find a way to translate this powerful economic leverage it has into political leverage and into political power, and to get Iran back to the negotiating table and to begin to diplomatically roll Iran back. Diplomacy is important here because it's under the guise of diplomacy that the Assad regime has invited Iran in. And it's through diplomacy that our allies are assessing out American weaknesses and strengths. For instance, the UAE and Lebanon are looking to welcome Syria back into the Arab League. That's a problem as long as the Syrian government, as the guest just said, continues to host Iran and permit Iran to operate there. So you basically want to have all these governments put their money where their mouth is, and it'll be a high bar for the U.S. to realize, for the U.S. to get a lot of these states to come to the table in Poland and actually issue sanctions or find out ways that they can cooperate in the future and make sure they have the authorities in place to push back on Iran diplomatically, politically, and economically.
Right. In the meantime, as we're saying, the situation is escalating on the ground. Behnam, thank you so much. Behnam Taleblu.